Chapter 6 Strength of Ice. Kopaka trekked steadily through the snowy tundra toward the distant mountains. Only an hour had passed since he had crept out from the canister that had washed up on the frigid shoreline on the far west side of the island. So far, aside from a few birds and a small cluster of crabs that scurried away when his canister opened, he found no sign of any inhabitants, and he liked it that way. Kopaka was lean and powerfully built. His armor was almost entirely white, with sections of metallic gray over his limbs. His mask was round, with half of it covered by a set of 3 scoped lenses on the right side that allowed him to alter his vision, leaving only one of his glowing aquamarine eyes visible. Fastened to his left forearm was a large, disc-shaped shield. On his right hand, he gripped a double-edged sword. The single blade of the sword was split down the middle into 2 separate pieces that joined at the hilt, leaving a small gap between them. Both the sword and the shield matched the white of his armor. Despite being alone, with nothing but the sound of his own feet crunching through the snow, and the howling wind gliding over the hills, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. He stopped and listened for a moment, but heard nothing. He activated the lenses on his mask, hoping they would assist him somehow. And they did. His mask began to glow as his vision shifted. Now he was able to see straight through the snow, even through the rock underneath. And that was how he found out he was right to be suspicious. He wasn't alone after all.
"Your cover is blown. Reveal yourself, little one,"
he called in a low, gravelly voice. It was the first time he had spoken since he arrived. In fact, it was likely the first time he had ever spoken at all. Through the newly discovered vision of his mask, he could see the newcomer hadn't moved. Returning to his normal vision, Kopaka leaped over the hill to confront the spy. He threw up his shield and pointed his blade out, mere inches from its face.
"I was talking to you,"
he said sternly. His observer threw his hands up in surrender.
"Wait!"
he pleaded.
"I wasn't trying to spy on you."
Kopaka wasn't sure if he believed him, but he clearly posed no threat. He hardly came up to Kopaka's midsection, and his ceaseless shaking likely wasn't caused by the cold weather. Kopaka lowered his weapons, but never broke his piercing gaze.
"Why were you hiding then?"
Kopaka pressed.
I was just out here hunting when I saw you come ashore,"
said the small being nervously.
I just wanted to get a closer look.
"Why?"
Because
the small being said before pausing.
Because you're the Toa of Ice. We've been waiting for you our whole lives.
"Why have you been waiting for me?"
All of us here on Motunui have been waiting for you. You and the others."
Kopaka only became increasingly confused with each word. The small being spent the next few minutes trying his best to explain the past and present events on the island, but his explanations were broken and incomplete. Somehow, Kopaka felt vaguely familiar with the stories. They reminded him of the dark dreams he had while he was drifting in the canister. The gist of the story was that Kopaka and 5 others like him were summoned to challenge a mighty evil to save the inhabitants of this unnaturally strange island.
"So, what happens next then?"
Kopaka finally asked.
"The Turaga of my village is out here hunting with me."
The small being, that Kopaka finally learned was a Matoran, replied.
"Our camp is just east of here. He can point you in the right direction. Follow me."
Kopaka was already growing tired of the company, but he still had so many questions. He realized if he wanted answers, following the Matoran to his Turaga would be his best chance at finding them. He nodded, and then silently gestured for the Matoran to lead the way. The Matoran proceeded to lead Kopaka along the snowy path. The pair walked in silence for several minutes before the Matoran had finally spoke up.
"My name is Maturo,"
the Matoran said, unprompted.
"It's an honor to finally meet the Toa of Ice."
"Kopaka,"
the Toa of Ice replied, impersonally.
Sorry I didn't reveal myself sooner.
Maturo continued.
I just needed to be sure you weren't just another one of Makuto's Rahi, and hiding has become second nature. It's the only way to survive outside the village walls.
Kopaka didn't respond this time. Maturo wasn't sure if that meant he hadn't accepted his apology, or if he just wasn't in the mood for conversation. Either way, Maturo didn't say another word for a long while. Instead, he returned to the uncomfortable silence that began when they first started walking together. Eventually, he decided it was probably for the best, though. It lessened the chance of being heard by one of Makuto's Rahi that could be lurking behind every rock or snowy hill. Logically, he knew he should feel safer now that he was in the presence of a Toa, especially if he was as powerful as the Turaga claimed he would be. But after so many years, he had forgotten what it was like to not be afraid of the Rahi. Like all Matoran, Maturo was small and stocky with childlike proportions. He was actually slightly taller than the average Matoran, but Kopaka never would have guessed that. Most of his body was white, while his hands, feet, and mask were pastel blue. The mask he wore was a great akaku, nearly identical in shape to Kopaka's. He wore a small leather satchel over his shoulder to hold his hunting supplies. Their silent hike eventually brought them alongside a great frozen chasm, stretching several miles ahead of them. Kopaka glanced down into the giant opening. The bottom was enveloped by darkness, making it difficult to judge the height of the drop. From what he could see, however, it was unlikely he would survive if he were to slip over the edge. On the opposite side of the trail, a curving ice wall rose several feet above their heads, contrasting the deep chasm on the other side. Icicles were formed along the top of the wall, where it protruded out from the rest of the formation, casting a shadow over the right side of the trail. He turned his focus back to the path ahead, where he noticed Maturo had become unsettled. The Komatoran kept looking up toward the sky, but when Kopaka tried to find what he was looking for, he saw nothing.
What is it?
Kopaka asked.
I thought I heard something.
Maturo whispered back. He slowed his pace, never dropping his gaze, until he finally stopped walking altogether. Kopaka gripped his sword tighter. Though he didn't know what Maturo could have heard, he decided trusting the judgment of someone that spent their entire life in the region was a good idea. He stood motionless for several seconds as Maturo continued to survey overhead.
Stick close to the wall,
Maturo said in a sharp whisper. He rushed over and pressed his body against the icy wall. Kopaka followed beside him, crouching down next to the Matoran. Several seconds passed before Maturo heard the sound again. This time, Kopaka heard it too. It was coming from over the top of their position. The sound of heavy footsteps thumping overhead. They were sporadic and irregular, and accompanied by occasional fluttering. Kopaka didn't know what could be making the sound, but it was clearly alive. As the source of the footsteps moved closer to the edge of the wall, he caught a glimpse of the shadow it casted over the trail in front of them. It was a massive winged creature, substantially larger than any bird he had seen since arriving. Maturo lifted his finger over the mouth of his mask, gesturing Kopaka to stay silent, though it was not like Kopaka ever had trouble staying silent since they met. The weight of the creature moving so close to the edge of the wall shifted icicles that hung over the side, causing a few of them to break loose. They shattered on the ground, a mere 2 feet away from Kopaka and Maturo. The sudden sound of breaking ice alerted the creature, seemingly unaware that it was the cause of it. It moved closer, wrapping its claws over the edge. It peered out, scanning the snowy trail for its prey. The shaded overhang above the wall prevented it from spotting the pair that hid directly below. From their vantage point, Kopaka could finally see what was hunting them. What he first assumed to be a giant bird of some kind was now revealed to be a giant insect. Its hideous mandibles that sprouted up from between its bulbous green eyes clicked together while its long, worm-like antennae writhed and swayed. Kopaka looked over at Maturo. The expression behind his mask was one of fear and caution, yet he didn't appear to be shocked or surprised. Kopaka could tell that Maturo was familiar with whatever this creature was. Minutes dragged by before the giant insect finally accepted defeat and turned back. Still, Maturo waited for another full minute before stepping back onto the trail. Kopaka followed him, and they continued along their journey, only this time walking much slower and cautiously.
What was that thing?
Kopaka finally asked.
Nui Rama.
Maturo answered.
They're one of the many species of Rahi under Makuta's control.
You used that word before,
Kopaka said.
Rahi. What does it mean?
Maturo glanced back at Kopaka, surprised by the question.
It's a bit of a blanket term,
He explained.
Any wild thing or beast that lives on this island, apart from the Matoran, is a Rahi.
Makuta controls your wildlife.
Kopaka asked with a minuscule hint of surprise in his voice.
Not all of them.
Maturo explained further.
Most species are still unaffected, but when Makuta took over the island, he infected several species of Rahi. Now they serve him. Instead of coming out of the shadows himself, he sends his pets to do his dirty work.
How can you tell they're infected?
There are a few ways you can tell. Did you notice the Nui Rama's eyes? That green glow? All of Makuta's Rahi have that. Another way to tell is that they're trying to kill you with suicidal determination.
Suicidal determination.
Kopaka repeated the phrase back to himself in his mind. It was an interesting description, but it seemed like an exaggeration. Maturo had barely opened his mouth to continue explaining when a heavy shadow swept over his body, darkening the sunlight. He looked up just in time to see the Nui Rama had returned. Maturo screamed in agony as it bore its claws into his shoulders, snatching him up from the ground. Kopaka sprung forward, slashing his sword toward the Nui Rama, narrowly missing its abdomen before it flew over his head. Maturo struggled to free himself as it carried him higher into the air. He knew falling from such a height would be a better alternative to letting the giant insect take him, even if it killed him, but its grip was too tight. Kopaka let his instincts take over. He thrust his blade forward in the direction of the Nui Rama. He felt a wave of ice-cold energy wash through his entire body. A solid spear of ice shot out from the tip of his sword. He paused to process what just happened, unsure of how he knew to attempt it. The ice hit its target, piercing through one of the Nui Rama's wings. The Rahi screeched, involuntarily releasing its hold of Maturo, dropping him straight toward the open chasm beside the path. Without hesitating, Kopaka unfastened his shield from his arm and tossed it to the ground. He dove over the edge of the chasm toward the falling Matoran. In one swift motion, he grabbed a hold of Maturo's wrist with his left hand and drove his sword into the side of the rift with his right. Maturo winced from the pain in his shoulder from the sudden stop as his feet dangled loosely over the bottom of the seemingly endless drop.
Don't struggle,
Kopaka called out through gritted teeth. He pressed his feet against the ice for leverage before pulling Maturo up, tossing him safely over the top of the chasm in an impressive feat of strength. Maturo tried to ignore the stinging pain in his shoulders as he pushed himself up from the snow. By the time he started to move back toward the edge to help Kopaka climb out of the chasm, the Toa had already pulled himself back up.
We're not done yet!
Maturo informed him.
Look!
Despite having one injured wing, the Nui Rama was already flying back toward them. It swung its abdomen forward, brandishing its knife-like stinger. This time, it was aiming for Kopaka. He rolled out of its path. He scooped his shield from the snow as it circled back for another attack. The Nui Rama swiped its claws at him, but he ducked underneath its body. As it passed over him, he swung his blade, slicing into its abdomen. The insect gave an ear-piercing screech as Kopaka raised up his shield to protect his eye from the odious fluids that sprayed out of the creature's fresh wound. it lost its bearings and tumbled into the snow. Kopaka was surprised to see the Nui Rama was already prepared to pounce again as soon as it turned itself upright. It stared back at him with its soulless green eyes, fluttering its wings to shake the snow off. Each one of its 4 wings was longer than Maturo's entire body. As it prepared to take flight again, Kopaka shot a stream of ice at its 2 left wings, freezing them together. Though it could no longer fly, it crawled toward Kopaka with intense ferocity. Its balance was unsteady, but it seemed unbothered by the hindrance. Once it reached Kopaka, it swiped at him with its claws, which he blocked with his shield. It swiped again. This time, he slashed its claws with his sword, wounding it. It kept attacking, even after he countered its 3rd strike by severing its limb entirely. It was clearly outmatched, but the aggression of its attack never faltered. It made no attempt to flee or submit. Finally, Kopaka jammed his blade into its face. The Nui Rama convulsed and hissed before dropping motionless into the snow. Kopaka held his breath, trying not to gag on the potent cloud of green gas that leaked out of the dead body. He stooped down to clean his sword in the snow.
Suicidal determination,
he muttered to himself. Maturo joined his side, rubbing his injured shoulders.
That was incredible,
he said breathlessly.
You saved my life, and you took down a Nui Rama all by yourself. I've never seen a Matoran do that.
How much further?
Kopaka asked abruptly, ignoring the Matoran's praise. Maturo stood silently for a moment before processing an answer.
We're just over a mile from the camp. We should be there soon. As long as we don't get attacked along the way, at least.
And what are the chances of that?
Higher than 0.
Kopaka finished cleaning his sword. He inspected the blade, ensuring no residue was left behind. He stood up, storing the sword against his left hip before resuming his march along the path. Maturo gave one final glance at the mangled mess that was once a Nui Rama before catching up to Kopaka. Neither one of them said another word for the remainder of the trip. Maturo was still shaken up from the encounter with the Nui Rama. Though the injuries were fairly mild, the stinging pain in his shoulders from being ripped from the ground was hard to ignore, and the thought of falling into the chasm before Kopaka had caught him made his stomach drop all over again. He had been hunting in Kauai for almost a century, and had plenty of close calls with Makuta's Rahi, but none as close as the one he just experienced. If he hadn't been in the presence of the Toa, he would likely be dead. Meanwhile, Kopaka was ready to reach the camp so he could part ways with the Matoran. He had nothing personally against Maturo, but he had quickly grown to miss the solace of traveling alone. He would rather not be stuck supervising the safety of someone so helpless. The path brought them down through a narrow valley at the base of a mountain range where they reached Maturo's camp. It was made up of a single dome-shaped tent with a few blankets laid out beside a small campfire, which was hardly more than embers. The Turaga of Kokoro knelt beside the fire, stoking it with a twig. Kopaka hung back and watched as Maturo rushed down the hill to greet the Turaga. Kopaka noticed they were the only ones out there.
Nushu!
Maturo called as he nearly lost his footing running down the snowy hill. The Turaga swung his head toward the direction of the call. Upon seeing Maturo, he stood up, instinctively grabbing his walking stick, which had the appearance of a giant ice pick. He met Maturo halfway, completely failing to notice the Toa of ice watching him from the top of the hill a short distance away. He had a light gray, square-shaped mask that formed an X shape around the eyes and mouth. The mask was decorated with a pair of small horns curving up from the forehead. He also wore a pure white cloak made of thick fur with a matching scarf around his neck. He didn't speak. Instead, he made a series of strange clicks and bird whistles as he approached Maturo.
Yes, I'm okay,
Maturo responded, seeming to perfectly understand the meaning of the silly noises. The Turaga gave a stern look before placing a hand on Maturo's shoulder when he noticed the bruised muscle tissue and scuffed mechanical plates, Maturo winced and pulled back.
Mostly okay.
He added. The Turaga gave another series of whistles.
It's a long story.
Maturo replied.
I'll tell you all about it later. I've got something more important to show you.
Maturo turned and pointed toward the towering figure walking down from the hill behind them. Kopaka joined beside Maturo without saying a word. The Turaga's eyes narrowed as he inspected the newcomer from top to bottom. He didn't appear to need any convincing that he was looking at the fabled Toa of ice.
Kopaka, this is Turaga Nuju.
Maturo said.
No one knows why, but he doesn't speak like we do. I serve as his right hand, and it's my duty to serve as his translator. He can answer any questions you have.
Okay,
Kopaka said.
I'm on my way to kill Makuta. Where can I find him?
Turaga Nuju shook his head. He whistled and chirped for a long while. Maturo softly nodded as he was taking in what was being said before relaying it back to Kopaka.
He says Makuta resides deep underground where no light ever touches. To reach him, each Toa will need to find 5 keystones scattered around the island. Once the keys are reassembled, you will have access to his lair.
Of course, there had to be a catch,
Kopaka said.
Where do I find these keystones?
Turaga Nuju answered with more whistles and clicks, which Maturo translated.
There are 6 keys, 1 for each Toa, and they're all divided into 5 keystones. He says your first can be found at the summit of Mount Ihu. It's just beyond this valley. It's the tallest mountain in Kauai.
That's all I need to know,
Kopaka said just before walking off toward his destination.
Wait.
Maturo called to the Toa, who was already some distance away.
He also suggested you find the other Toa first. He's worried you may be underestimating Makuta's power.
Kopaka stopped, glancing back over his shoulder.
If that were so, he wouldn't be sending bugs to kill me.